Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Thomas Brandstetter, and I'm the new Manager of Policy and Issues with BFO. I'd like to thank Bethany for the opportunity to introduce myself and look forward to working with the team at BFO to ensure we provide support to Ontario beef farmers on a wide variety of issues. Dry conditions in areas across the province are the reason why we're here today, and I wanted to let you know we are monitoring rainfall data in Environment Canada's Drought Monitor on a regular basis. I'd now like to introduce Evan, Policy Advisor on our team, to let you know what additional measures we are taking to address the issue.
Yep, good afternoon, everyone. BFO President Rob Lipset has met with Minister Thompson 3 weeks ago to discuss the current drought situation here in Ontario. Last Friday, we asked the province and the provincial minister to begin the assessment under the Ag Recovery Framework to evaluate the scope and severity of drought here in Ontario, and investigate the potential of ag recovery response and to assist producers affected in regions as practically as possible. This process takes time. Our provincial cattle association counterparts in British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba are making similar requests to their provincial leaders and the federal government. A number of potential policy responses have been developed by the 5 provinces and the Canadian Cattlemen's Association, which the sector will be sharing with the provincial and federal ministers once these meetings are arranged. Now we are going to be listening to Christine O'Reilly from OMAFRA, the Forage and Grazing Specialist out of the Ag Development Branch.
Thanks, Evan. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here today. So I'd like to talk a little bit about managing forages and pastures in dry conditions. So still getting used to GoToWebinar as a platform. Why will my slide not advance? There we go. So when we're talking about our forage supplies, there's really the supply side and the demand side. It's like 2 sides of a coin. So this is the first of 2 what I'm calling screenshot slides. Myself and my colleagues have come up with a list of some things that you can do on farm to reduce livestock demand on this first slide. So things like identifying cows to be culled earlier than originally planned, preg checking, culling cows that are open, weaning early potentially to sell off the calves is another way to just reduce demand because those cows will stop milking, their feed requirements may decrease a little bit there. Moving to AI means you don't have to carry the bull, so that's one less mouth to feed, and he's a big guy, so he does eat a lot. Another option would be to dry lot the cows and graze the young stock. They're lighter, they eat less, that puts less pressure on the pasture. So these are some ideas of ways that you might be able to reduce demand. They're all difficult decisions, they're often emotional decisions, but they are part of that whole farm picture because this is the end of the equation that you have more control over. The other side is increasing forage supply. So this is my other screenshot slide. This is the list of a lot of the things we're going to be talking about today. So if it's available, potentially purchasing additional forage. Usually earlier is better where possible, just because prices tend to go up. Another option is to feed straw with a high protein grain, like a dry distiller's grain, or a complete feed block. So a lot of the feed companies have products that are totally balanced nutritionally. All they need is a fiber component, and that's where the straw comes in. The next 4 points are what I'm going to delve into with this talk, but we'll run through them accompanying this slide just to give you the overview. So cereals at soft dough stage, that depending where you are in the province might be our winter cereals, more likely to be our spring cereals that were planted for grain this spring. They could be chopped for green feed or put up as silage. If you're not doing it already, starting rotationally grazing is an option. Seeding spring cereals after that cereal grain harvest, whether it's winter cereals or spring cereals are coming up grain, you could throw some spring cereals in after that. Locating grain crop stover or cover crops for grazing this fall, and potentially seeking out grazing in another area that's had more rain. So that's kind of a list of ideas we've pulled together. As I mentioned, for today, I want to focus on the things that are really agronomy type things? What are the cropping things that you might be able to do to increase that forage supply? So before we get into that, your one and only Dan Ferguson and team have pulled together a video just kind of talking about some of the stuff Dan's been doing to deal with the dry weather. So unfortunately, we weren't able to get the sound to work in our trial run, but Dan's going to talk us through what we're watching on his farm.
Yeah, so hopefully you can hear me. And what I'm doing here is it's a field that I pulled the rye off of about 2 weeks ago. This is on the 29th of July. I'm putting 2 bags per acre of peas, oats, and barley in this field. And my hope is to kind of supplement the green feed. So you've caught me here in the field, feeding this field. And I'm using my old 510 International drill, which is a pretty non-modern piece of equipment. I'm going to put 2 bags per acre. They cost $25 a bag. And my hope is here to get more green feed ready for 8 weeks out early into September before the frost hits. So that is kind of the approach of this video. And I'll put a bit more seed in the drill right now, I think. Unfortunately, the sound isn't syncing, guys, but this is me fast forward. I don't usually move this fast. Just thought I'd give you a sense of the ambition I can get when I have a good coffee. But the math on the field is basically 2 bags of seed. The bags cost $25 a bag, so that's $50 an acre. And I'm hoping to get 5 bags off the field, 5 bales off the field. And so 1 bale will cover the seed cost. 1 bale would cover the tractor and my time, and the other bale that I get would cover the rent of the land. And so the other 2 bales that I get, aiming for 5 bales an acre, would be return on investment and give me lots of green feed going into the September, early fall window for my cows and calves. So that's basically the script there, Christine. Hopefully that synced with the video. Thanks.
I think you did a fantastic job ad-libbing that for us. Thank you, Dan. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the choices that you made on that video. So remind me again, what crops did you seed? What was in that mix?
Yeah, it was peas, oats, and barley that I was putting in there, about 2 bags to the acre, which is a little over 100 pounds to the acre. And part of my rationale behind that, Christine, was that I did that in the spring earlier. There's a field right beside this one that's underseeded, so I had extra seed left over, around 12 bags. And so that's what kind of steered me towards using that variety, and I bought a bit more to do this. It's a 6-acre field running up there, and then there's an additional piece behind it, another 6 acres, so I'm hoping to get some good green out of that. The other problem is there's other options out there, Christine, but my drill is old and it doesn't calibrate so well. And so some of the other options aren't really feasible for me, like a sorghum or a small seed, because the cups, when we drop the seed down into it, I can't set it back enough to seed some of the other options that you might present later in your talk. But that's kind of why I went with this combination. So.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great choice. I think it fits really well with your setup, and the fact that you had the seed on hand already is a bonus, right? It's something you already had in the shed. You might as well use it before the germ's gone. Yeah, I don't actually talk about warm season crops so much in this talk today, just because we're getting a little late to seed them in most parts of the province. So if you're in one of those southern counties, maybe parts of the west, you might have a long enough growing season to get one cut off of a warm season grass like a sorghum sudan grass or a millet. But we're getting kind of tight on that timeline for most of the province. So I didn't talk about those species for this one just because of that reason. But you're right, they're very small seeded a lot of the time, and calibrating the drill can be hard. So for sure, those cereals can be a little bit more forgiving, and we'll talk a bit more about those in a minute.
Yeah, the other thought too, Christine, was trying to get this done before frost. It's a low-lying area where I was in, So I was trying to consider something that would move along quick enough, give me enough yield before I was worried about a kill effect from frost or toxicity from frost on the crop. The other option, just since I love to talk, was that this field has access to water, and if that drought was going to persist, even though now we're getting lots of rain, I needed access to the water supply for the cows. I've got 50 cow-calf pairs and the farmer is approachable to fencing, so I could run a hot wire, being that my cows are perfectly trained to electric fence. I could run a hot wire, and I could gradually put them through 2 acres every 2 days and kind of graze it across that way without having to use the machinery to harvest the crop. So those things all weighed into my decision with this on that property at this time. So yeah.
Yeah, for sure. It's a nice bonus that you've got the flexibility that you could make baleage or graze that piece. That's a nice flexibility.
For sure. Yeah.
All right, so Dan has foreshadowed some of the things I'm going to talk about really wonderfully. So thank you so much, Dan. And yeah, if anyone's got further questions for Dan, stick them in the chat, and we can tackle those near the end. So,
yep.
Oh goodness, now my slides don't advance again. There we are. Okay, so the first of those agronomy kind of options that I laid out was harvesting cereals at the soft dough stage. So I'm talking about things that were planted in the spring intended for grain, or your winter cereals intended for grain that haven't come off yet. The biggest thing to consider for this is if they're insured, call Agricor before you do anything. And I'm not talking about calling your local adjuster, like call head office in Guelph. They want to know, they want to make sure they've got all their paperwork in order before you harvest that crop. They've got a system in place to do this, so it's definitely something that they can process to switch that acreage use from grain to forage, but they do want the heads up beforehand. So just keep that in mind if this is an option that you're considering. When we're looking at using cereals, by the time they get to soft dough, that stem is basically straw, and the kernels are filling, we're getting some starch happening there. So this is not baleage. It's not going to, wrap the same way that if we had taken this at like between flag leaf and heading, this isn't going to feed like a grass baleage. This is not exactly corn silage, but it's much more similar, right? Because we've got starchy grain and we've got essentially straw, we got a lot of lignin in there. So this is something that you can either chop and feed it fresh or chop it and put it up in a silo. Now, if you don't have the silo space, this might be an opportunity to get a bag in, just as that temporary flexible storage, just because it's not going to store nicely in a baleage. You're gonna have straw poking through that plastic and a greater risk of spoilage. Plus things don't ferment as thoroughly in baleage. So this is potentially an option to boost those inventories. It's not going to feed exactly like corn silage because of the difference in starch digestibility between corn versus cereal grains, but it is something that could boost the feed. It's got some energy in it, it's got some fiber in it, and so that's potentially an option if you've got some acres that you could switch. All right, the second agronomy point that I mentioned was if you're not rotationally grazing, start. And the reason for this is that grasses really need time to rest and recover. And when they're stressed because they don't have enough water, they need longer to recover. So when we're in a continuously grazing situation, while to us it looks like the cows have all this space to go and graze in practice what happens is they tend to graze the same areas over and over and over and over again. And they'll leave the rest of it to get over mature and stemmy and unpalatable, and they don't touch it. So by rotationally grazing, by putting up those cross fences, we're changing where the cows spend their time in that pasture landscape. And it means they're going to use more of the grass that we grow. It means that grazing is going to happen a little more evenly across that pasture. And it means that because they can't access all of the field all at once, their favorite spots get a chance to rest and recover. So we're forcing them to eat stuff before it gets stemmy and yuck. And we're also giving their favorite stuff time to rest and recover. So it evens that all out a little bit better. pastures that have been managed like this going into dry conditions are usually going to do much better than those starting in the middle of dry conditions. But I want to really emphasize it's never too late to start rotationally grazing, and just giving the grasses that rest and recovery they need will help. The image I've got on screen really is trying to illustrate how these grasses recover. So the first one on the left is basically that plant has just been grazed. It's got a full root system. The energy stores in a grass plant tend to be in the lower stem and a little bit in the roots. Legumes tend to put more, because they've got those tap roots, they tend to store starch down in that tap root. So their energy stores are really in their roots. But once we take away those leaves by grazing, it's those energy stores the plants are drawing on to regrow. So it takes some time. Within about 5 days, they start mobilizing those energy reserves out of the roots and lower stem. And the root system actually sloughs off. Like the root hairs start to slough off as they're pulling the carbohydrates back out. So you get a smaller root system shortly after a plant has been grazed. So once that plant starts to regrow new leaf material, it's actually got a very small root system. And when we're thinking about this in the context of dry weather, if that root system has, shrunk because we've pulled energy out of the plant, it also can't reach water as deep in the soil as it could. So this is another reason why rest during dry conditions is so important. And the other thing to keep in mind is like this third grass plant here, its gas tank is empty. It's put all of its energy reserves into growing that like 1 or 2 brand new leaves. So it's starting to do photosynthesis, it's starting to produce sugar again. And it can be really tempting for us to put the cows back out when grasses look like this, because there's new growth there and it's green and delicious. But that's actually the time that it's most stressful on that plant because the energy reserves are gone. So the way grasses divvy up their energy is they'll put out a new leaf to do photosynthesis, and they'll put all the sugar they produce into growing the next new leaf until they have enough leaves to produce more sugar than they need for growth. Once they're producing excess sugar, then they start to fill the root reserves. Then they start to grow those roots back. So it's only once we have 3 or 4 fully developed leaves that grass plant not only has leaves for our cattle to graze, but it also has a root system and energy reserves to bounce back as quickly as the weather conditions will allow it. So something to keep in mind, overgrazing is less about the height and more about the timing. And so hitting it when there's nothing in the tank, that's really overgrazing. So we really want to give it the time to get those 3 or 4 fully developed leaves. And that's where that rotational grazing comes in if you're not. And if you are, slowing down that rotation, giving each paddock a longer rest period, just to let those plants recover fully so that hopefully next year, this pasture is not going to have a hangover from being grazed too hard during that stressful weather. Okay, another agronomy type option to boost our forage inventories is to do what Dan just showed us he's done on his farm, and that's seeding spring cereals. Usually the first opportunity is after a cereal comes off, whether that's, a winter cereal. Dan said he took off some rye. It could be winter wheat coming off. It could be a spring cereal harvest as well. Depending where you are in the province, a little later this year, there may be some soybeans coming off, and there might be some open ground there that you could stick some spring cereals into. So ideally, we're looking to find that opening in the crop rotation where there's nothing growing anyway, stick in some spring cereals. In the fall, because conditions tend to be cooler, cereals are growing a little more slowly. So in the spring, it might take about 45 to 60 days for that crop to get to boot stage. In the fall, we're looking more at 60 to 70 days is much more typical, unless we have a really warm, open fall with the right rainfall as well. So probably 60 days to get to boot stage. Now, there was a bunch of research that Dr. Bill Dean at the University of Guelph did back 2012, 2013, trying to find the right recipe of, what spring cereals, what rates, how do we make that work when we're trying to get forage production quickly? And his results gave us the recipe on this screen. So 80 pounds per acre of oats plus 50 pounds per acre of nitrogen. And I do want to talk through why this is the recipe, because since 2013, some of these variables have changed a little bit on us. So that trial looked at a range of different seeding rates. They had some that were lower, they had some that were higher. But what the researchers found was that if you have a lower seeding rate, you miss out on yield potential. If you go much higher than 80 pounds an acre, you don't get significantly more yield. So Dan went 100 pounds an acre, no problem with that, partly because he already had the seed in the shed. If he was strapped on a budget, could he have dialed that back to 80? Yeah, probably. 100 is not going to hurt, but that's where 80 pounds comes from, is that jacking up that seed rate much more beyond 80 is not really going to give you any benefit and probably isn't worth the cost of seed if you don't already have it in the shed. Okay, so that's 80 pounds. Why oats? This came down to seed prices. Oats are often the cheapest spring cereal to buy. That's not always the case. Sometimes it depends on supply and demand in your local area. So the study also looked at barley and spring triticale. The great thing about spring cereals is that the difference in forage quality between these species is very, very small, so long as they're at the same stage of maturity. So from a forage quality perspective, you can interchange them pretty easily. That's not something that's a huge concern. The other factor I think to weigh in is oats tend to be much more susceptible to crown rust, definitely than barley, also than triticale. So very often growers that grow spring cereals as forage regularly as part of their planned crop rotation, they're applying a fungicide to those oats just to make sure that they don't get really rusty, because while the rust doesn't produce any mycotoxins, it does affect palatability and it does affect nutritional quality because that fungus is eating the sugars and proteins out of your forage. So the seed cost of oats is cheaper. I don't have any data on where the tipping point is on that fungicide. So, take a look at your setup, take a look at what equipment you've got, decide, seed cost of oats is less, it probably needs a fungicide. Probably costs a little bit more. They probably don't. I can't say for sure that they won't, because it does depend what the fall does, but that's some of those considerations to weigh. But the reason it's oats is based purely on cost. And then 50 pounds an acre of nitrogen. That's because cereals are grasses. They need nitrogen. They don't fix it themselves. And that 50 pounds will give us a nice boost to get some forage off that in the fall. So the other question that I get asked a lot about spring cereals as forage is, should I include peas? And everyone hates it when I say this. The answer is it really depends. Pea seed can often be expensive. So normally I suggest to producers, pencil it out. Figure out, what is the pea seed cost versus other protein sources. Soybean meal, canola meal, dried distillers grains, those kinds of things, and figure out what's really going to be the most economical for your operation. Especially, this is important because when we're including peas in a cereal mix, ideally we're trying to hit it so that that mix is 50% peas by weight. So if our total seed mix is, let's say, 100 pounds an acre, 50 pounds is our cereal, 50 pounds is our peas. That should increase your crude protein between 2 and 4%, depending on the growing conditions and the stage of maturity at which you harvest it. And people are often surprised that it's only 2 to 4%. Like from a plant perspective, that's huge. From a feed perspective, I know that sometimes seems a little low. So this is why I really encourage you to pencil it out. What's the pea seed and the protein you get versus other protein supplements and their cost right now? I think that's especially important this year just because soybean prices are so high, canola prices are very strong. So some of those protein sources may be pricier than they were last year. Peas might be a viable option, but again, pencil it out for yourself, figure out what prices are looking like, what you can get, and yeah, that'll help weigh into that decision whether or not peas are worth adding. Okay, locating stover for grazing. So Dan kind of touched on this a little bit with his discussion about the field that he was seeding down with some cereals, is that to have something that's flexible for grazing or harvest, he needed to make sure he had a water source. So obviously, and I know you guys know this, but when we're grazing, fencing, water, and a handling system are critical to make sure that can work. How are we going to keep them on the field? How are we going to water them? And can we get them on and off without losing them down. There's lots of ways to go about this. Often some of these solutions are very site specific. So it comes down to, you know, having conversations with whoever's ground it is if it's not yours. Thinking about it, I guess the only other caution I would give you is make sure those animals are fence trained very well before you put them out on some sort of stover or a cover crop, and make sure that fence can stay hot. So this is not a great option for young stock. It can work well with cows that tend to have a bit more experience with the fence. The other thing I want to mention about locating stover for grazing, and this is unique to stover, is it's basically straw with whatever grain got kicked out the back of the combine. So taking a forage analysis is really, really useful to determine what your supplemental needs are. I encourage forage analysis most of the time with stored forage as well. This is the main grazing situation where I think it's very important because the feed quality is probably pretty stable because it is a stover. The plant's not growing anymore. But yeah, it's kind of like feeding a straw. So they're probably going to need a little bit of protein. They're probably going to need a little, well, they may not need energy if they'll find the grain that's out in that field. So having that forage analysis, working with a nutritionist to figure out what those cows need to keep them over the winter is really important for grazing stover. So grazing cover crops has similar infrastructure considerations as far as fencing, water, how are you going to get them back onto the trailer when you're ready to bring them home. But I didn't want to go into too much depth on cover crop grazing today because we do have some webinars coming up in November talking more about cover crop grazing. We've got some recordings from last year's webinars up on the On Field Crops YouTube channel, so you can check those out as well. But there's lots of ongoing conversation happening about grazing cover crops and how we can get, you know, that feed benefit as well as some of the other benefits. The theme this year is sustaining life above and below, so the soil health as well as animal productivity. So stay tuned for those dates. They're coming. Okay, that's what can we do from an agronomic perspective when it is dry? What can we do in the moment while we're trying to get through this? Some parts of the province have had rain in the time between starting to plan this webinar and now. So, and you know, all of us at some point we'll get to winter and there's a great opportunity to plan. So I do want to talk a little bit about some of the things to think about going forward. This is my most important future planning slide. I would encourage you guys to work with your nutritionist and your agronomist to come up with that forage and feed grain crop plan. And when I'm using the terms nutritionist and agronomist, I am using these fairly loosely. Like your nutritionist is whoever helps you with your feed plan, and your agronomist is whoever helps you with your crop plan. But my challenge to you, what I would love to see all of you do is come have a meeting with all three of these people at the table, whether that's, you know, if it's safe to do some kitchen table meeting. If it's not, most smartphones have a feature where you can, they'll say add call or merge call. So you call one of them and then you hit that button and you call the other and you tap the button again and you're on a three-way call. You can all hear each other. And the reason that this is so valuable is because each of those advisors has specialized very specifically. So it's rare to find one that has a strong working knowledge of both nutrition and agronomy. And so sometimes those advisors will make suggestions that make sense for their field, and the other advisor has no idea why that was suggested. And instead of you, the producer, playing a bad game of broken telephone, you just get everyone on the same phone call, on the same conversation, you can make a really rock star forage plan. So that agronomist is probably going to be focused mostly on yield potential, on the crop rotation. So how do we minimize plant diseases, plant pests? Where does the manure fit in really well? Those kinds of things. They're going to be all over your soil type, your soil test, nutrient management, that kind of stuff. The nutritionist looks at your forage crops as feed ingredients. Their major concern is usually crop quality. They're all over what the animal needs. What do these cows need? What do your yearlings need to make sure that they're performing really, really well? You, the producer, you're also an expert. You're an expert in what labor you have available on your farm. You know what equipment you have available. You also understand, what are your farm's goals? What are the past challenges? How does all of this fit into your production system? You're the practical expert of getting stuff done. So there's 3 very knowledgeable people that can come together and create a really strong forage and feed grain production plan if you're willing to use that advice. So I strongly suggest get everybody on the same conversation. This may be a project for over the winter, but it's something that I really feel is worth doing. Okay, part of why it's great to have that big plan is because if you look at the whole growing season, we do have lots of options for crops in Ontario, and they all fill different roles. Being in July, it's a little harder to squeak some of these in last minute, but if we're planning this from the beginning, there are a lot of options. So perennials, obviously, they're cheaper to grow per ton because we can spread that seeding cost out over several years and many harvests. Whereas annuals tend to fill production gaps really nicely. In the past, we called them emergency forages because we had such a surplus of hay from our perennial stands that it was really cheap. That surplus of production isn't so much a thing anymore. A lot of acres have been converted to annual grain crops. So that gap in the value of hay versus the cost to grow annual forage has closed significantly. They're not quite on par, but the difference in cost could very well be how you value your peace of mind in that situation. So annuals can fill production gaps very, very nicely. When we're weighing out, do you want to go more legumes, do you want to go more grass? Think about what role those different types of crops play in a ration. Legumes tend to provide protein and fiber. Grasses tend to provide energy and fiber, and that energy may be as starch and it may be as sugars, depending on the crop and what time during its development that you harvest it. We've got cool season crops, we've got warm season crops. So these different species have different times of year when they grow fastest. So cool season prefers spring and fall. Warm season prefers that hot summer weather. So again, having a mix of these in your whole farm forage production system can really help even out those times of year when typically, historically, we wouldn't have had a whole lot of forage being produced just because of our reliance on those cool season perennials. And then there's a whole bunch of other more detailed stuff to think about. How are you going to harvest it? Are you going to graze it? Are you going to harvest it mechanically? Do you want something that could be a dual purpose crop? Fitting those crops to your environment and your landscape, so thinking about the soil drainage and pH, and then how does each of these crops fit into a crop rotation? So this is all stuff that the agronomist can hopefully help you with, but there are a lot of options out there if we're able to plan where we want to put them. So this is the after we're through this. This is some stuff you can do to help, maybe minimize the effects of something like this happening again in future. Okay, fertility. Fertility is probably the weak link that I see most often in forage production systems and pastures. So for those of you who aren't familiar, for our nutrient stewardship means that you're applying the right source of nutrients at the right time, in the right place, and at the right rate. So source, rate, time, and place. This means that manure gets taken advantage of, really using your manure to the best of our ability, topping up with fertilizer where we need to. And all of this fertility planning stuff really does depend on a soil test, so that we're feeding the crop exactly what it needs. We're not giving it too much, we're not giving it too little. Because at the end of the day, really, we need these crops to feed our cattle, but they can't feed the cattle properly if we don't feed the crops properly. So the foundation of this really is a soil test. Our suggestion is to take a soil test at least once every 3 years for hay fields, for crops that are mechanically harvested, for any of your grain fields. once every 3 years usually will help us track how things are changing. You can get away with once every 5 years for pasture, those perennial pastures, because the nutrient drawdown is slower. The cattle do remove some plant nutrients in their own tissues, in their bodies when they leave. But because most of the nutrients get cycled through and returned to that pasture as manure and urine, the drawdown of nutrients is slower in the soil, so we can get away with testing less frequently and still stay on top of the nutrients there. When it comes to stored forage specifically, there's probably room to improve on, tracking our inventories so that we know what we've got before we head into these challenging situations. So weighing and moisture testing forage during harvest as it's coming off the field, that way you know exactly what's going in the shed, in the silo, and taking a forage sample from each lot so that if you're in a situation again where inventories are a little tight, being able to look at those forage analyses and start giving, the most nutrient dense feed to the group of livestock that has the highest nutritional demands, and the feed that really didn't come out the way you wanted to, maybe that goes to a group that has the lowest nutritional demands, and start matching lots to management groups. That's something that could be done now if you were to sample stuff, but it's also something that if you had as part of your routine forage production, had that in your back pocket, it'd be very easy to start allocating those lots differently and making more efficient use of the forage that you put up. All right, so that's everything I brought slide-wise for you today. I'm happy to take some questions, and my contact information is up on the screen. So.
Thanks, Christine. Happy to have you. So if anybody has any questions that they want to ask Christine, there should be a question box in the panel that you have joined us with. So if you could just write your questions out there, and we'd be happy to offer them to Christine or Dan, who I'm going to unmute right here and add him. As well, if you have any questions for Evan or Thomas, I can pass those along to him, both of them as well. So feel free to add any questions you have in there. And I know, Dan, you had a question as well.
Sure, I'll start with that. If you can hear me good, Beth, just give a nod. Yep. There. Good, great, yeah. Beth had forwarded me a question from the Valley, Renfrew. And it was a question from a brilliant producer up that way who says, if you don't get rain, what is your plan then? And in my situation, the field that I was seeding there is a low field. It's got good, it's like in a normal year, you wouldn't get through it for half of the year. So I felt that it was a good place to put the seed so it would come along mid-season. And that was my plan there. But if everything gets super dry, then it's a matter of sourcing hay early, seeing what I can get for stock, to supplement the cattle. Looking at neighbors that have maybe wrapped the wet feed and get some access to it. It's a bit difficult to handle. Like once you puncture it, it's got a short shelf life to get it out in those cows because I don't have the clam apparatus. But yeah, that was some of my considerations in the dry year. And other than that, unfortunately, I'd be faced with that cull, which is the worst word for producers that have built a cow herd that they're not looking to cull or reduce. So those would be some of my backup plans in a year where if it didn't come around and rain like this, that would be my answer to that question, if that's satisfactory. I also wanted to mention to Christine's point about rotational grazing, as much as she talked about it in the agronomy sense, I talk about it in the cattle management sense. If you have your cows trained to wire and to, 5,000 volts, then your options are way more open. You might find a cash crop farmer where you can do the grazing. You might find a piece that needs to be cleaned up. And if those cows are trained to that, then you're minimizing your costs of of moving the cattle into an area that is greener and richer and lower, or swamp grass or whatever it is. So that is another real good reason to do rotational grazing. So your stock is trained to that mechanical perimeter. So I just wanted to put in there too. Yeah.
Do you want another good reason, Dan?
Sure.
Yeah. So when we look at research and experience of continuous grazing systems versus rotational grazing systems, your carrying capacity on a rotationally grazed system is higher. So what that means is you can run more cows on the same land base. Now, if you're starting right now, that's not necessarily something that you want to be doing, is going out and buying more cows if you're concerned about forage inventories. But the point, the point that I'm making is, because those plants are healthier, they're producing more. A cow can only eat so much at one time, but because you've got more palatable, nutritious forage out there, then you've got higher carrying capacity by having that rotational system. So by implementing it now, that might be just enough of a boost to kind of work through these dry conditions. To implement it when we're not hit by adverse weather means that, maybe that would affect the herd size that your farm could carry. But yeah, there's lots of great stuff with rotational grazing.
Okay, yeah, and you did mention about grazing cover crops this fall. So our producer engagement team, we've kind of lined up Steve Kenyon for August the 25th. And we're going to tell the board in the summer meeting next week that this is a good audience for that. And his topic would be fencing systems and watering with an Ontario, Eastern Canada spin, as opposed to the Western model. So we're looking forward to that. It'd be an evening talk in August. August 25th is what we're aiming for tentatively right now. So hopefully we get some tips there. The other point you made earlier, Christine, was about the pasture hangover. And most of us have experienced some kind of a hangover. And the idea that rotational systems are very good for, I know my girls, when I move them in, I'm getting better every year. I've got local neighbors that try to up my game all the time with challenging me with what I say I should be doing. So this year, when I move them into a new grazing, they go the perimeter right away to find out if this is all you got. And then they work into grazing. They pick up the clovers, they pick up that nice new fresh growth, but they're always after the ultimate greener pasture somewhere. But it is really working. It's just great to see them respect the fence and then consume the product that you put into a rotation. So it's great. But
And Dan, you've reminded me of a point that I wanted to make that I don't think I mentioned during my slides, but when we're short on feed, I completely understand. The only thing that matters is, making sure we have enough feed. That is priority number one. But it often means that we tend to throw the agronomy right out the window, right? Like, it doesn't matter. I'm just taking the feed. Let's make sure we've got enough for the cows. And the challenge with that is, while it works as a one-off, it does stress those crops hugely. And the challenge that I see for our sector going forward is that this is probably not a one-off. As scary as it is to say it, but climate scientists have been saying for years that what climate change will look like is hotter heat waves, colder cold snaps, more frequent drought, more violent storms. So the fact that that's kind of the things that we're starting to see in the last couple of years, I think those scientists are right, that because it's matching with what we're seeing as producers on the ground. So what that means is, to panic and throw the agronomy out the window at the first sign of trouble is probably not a winning strategy anymore, because we can't feel confident that next year is going to be that mild, lovely, regular rainfall, beautiful haymaking conditions that we had a bit more consistently, 30 years ago. So agronomy is going to become very, very important in making sure we've got good feed for those cows, so that we can keep on, raising cows, doing the thing that we love. So yeah, please don't throw the agronomy out the window at the first sign of trouble. If you have to throw the agronomy out because you're in a tight situation, really spend the winter planning. Okay, how are we going to get the agronomy back on track so that we can get the most forage production and we can have the feed supplies that we need? Because yeah, to always cut during the fall rest period and to always, you know, throw something in without taking a soil test and making sure that fertility is there, and it really starts to wear on the crop. And then it gets harder for that crop to even meet its yield potential in a good year. So agronomy, very, very, very important.
So
Any other questions, Beth?
Yeah, we've got lots of questions. So not to interrupt this great discussion you guys have going on, but there's lots of questions here. So one of them here, can you talk a bit about manure application following forage harvest during a hot and dry period?
Yeah. I know it's unusual to have liquid manure on a lot of beef farms, but if you have it, that's a double awesome, because not only are you getting nutrients, but you're also getting a little bit of, it's not really irrigation, but like irrigation. Yeah, so solid manure can be applied to forages. It's a little bit of a management game though. So if it's solid manure, we really want to make sure that it is rotted enough that it's the consistency of corn silage. Because if we have big clumps that we're spreading on a forage stand, you can smother the plants underneath, which obviously we don't want because then there's holes in our field. So make sure that it's really well rotted. Timing wise, we want to get it on as soon after cutting as is physically possible. This is a lot easier in a haylage or a baleage situation because, you know, we cut the crop, we wilt it for a couple of days, we bale it, we wrap it, we get it out of the field, boom, we can apply manure. That's awesome for the forage plants because they're going to start regrowing within 5 days. It's harder in a hay system because it might take 10 days, you know, between cutting, tedding, raking, baling, getting the bales out, getting the manure on, right? So there's longer, there's going to be some damage to those regrowing plants in the wheel tracks. That'll delay them a little bit, that'll lower your yield a little bit in those wheel tracks. But you're applying manure on a living crop, which prevents nutrient runoff, helps you use the nutrients in a place where they have value. Yeah, there's enough wins there that I think it's still worth doing, but really don't push that manure application any later than you have to, is I guess the suggestion there. The other one is applying manure to a field that's going to be taken for baleage at the next cut is not really recommended because of concerns with Johne's disease. Yeah, that anaerobic environment where it doesn't fully ferment is kind of a risk. So not great before baleage.
Another question for grazing cover crops, any toxicity issues we should be aware of and methods to manage or what to watch for?
Yeah, that really depends on what species are in the mix. So if you're new to that, keep it simple, play it safe. Cereals rarely develop full grain heads in the fall just because it's cooler, they're growing slower. So even rumen acidosis is a very low risk because they don't even develop full seeds. So cereals are a very, very safe, very easy one to get started with. Clovers and brassicas, bloat is always a potential risk, but again, it's a manageable risk. When we get into some more species specific ones, some of the more unique things, sorghum sudan grass is very popular, but as Dan kind of mentioned, it will produce prussic acid when it's stressed. So it does not tolerate frost. If it's been cut or grazed, that new regrowth is very high in prussic acid until it's over a couple of feet tall. Those are the most common scenarios where it'll produce prussic acid, which basically breaks down in the rumen and as cyanide poisoning, essentially is what happens. So that's one that we don't want to mess with, but we do have very clear ideas of when that happens and how to manage it. So I've got some resources on sorghum sudan grass. If anyone's interested, they can follow up with me after. Some other ones that are common would be any of our oilseed crops. oilseed radish, oilseed rape, which is related to canola but is not canola. Mustards, those kinds of things can have glucosinolates and erucic acid in them. Both of those can be toxic as well. So forage rape, forage radish, which is also daikon and tillage radish, those are all very closely related things. They don't have those toxins in them, but the oilseed varieties do, so watch out for those. Hairy vetch. Haven't found a clear explanation of how hairy vetch happens. I don't think vets are really, sorry, hairy vetch toxicosis happens. I don't think vets really know. So that's one to leave out of a cover crop mix as well. So those are kind of the most common ones. The Midwest Cover Crop Council Selector tool is actually a great resource, not only for helping you choose what's going to make great grazing or great stored forage or both, but also they've got links to lots of fact sheets from Ontario as well as some of the states in the Midwest that talk a bit more about, you know, things to watch for, how to manage some of those challenges. So yeah, there's a few species I would not put in a grazing mix. There's a few more species that I would not put in a baleage mix just because they don't store very nicely. Like baling sunflowers is a pain and probably isn't going to work very well. But cows love them, like they're delicious. So yeah, there's a lot of variables. So Midwest Cover Crop Council Selector tool is probably a great starting point to find some of those resources quickly on the specific species that you're interested in.
Okay. Another question, can we dry bale our oat fields?
That's going to be tricky. Usually, like oat hay isn't very common in Ontario because we're so humid. So they do make oat hay on the prairies. It would be difficult to get the dry weather to bale them in the fall.
That was a question coming from Northern Ontario, so they might have a little better.
The Northwest, like once we get west of the Great Lakes, your climate is a lot more like the prairies, so you may actually have better luck, but generally east of the Great Lakes we're too humid to get those cereals properly dry, which is why we tend to go baleage. So I guess for oat hay resources I would direct you to Manitoba, just because we don't really do any of it.
It was coming from a Rainy River request, so they might be able to.
Yeah. So let me see who's on the Manitoba side. Glenn Friesen has a role similar to mine with Manitoba. So he may have some fact sheets and stuff that he can direct you to on oat hay.
Okay, another question. How late can a shot of nitrogen have an effect on pasture yield?
That's a great question. I think probably by, depending where in the province you are, sometime in September, probably not worth it. And I wouldn't put it on if you're not planning a fall grazing. So the thing to watch with nitrogen in a dry year is nitrogen gets into the plant by moving with the soil water. So when we apply nitrogen, ideally we're injecting it somehow so it's not volatilizing or it's some sort of slow release nitrogen. But when we do finally get that rainfall that breaks the dry spell, that's going to flush a whole bunch of nitrogen into that plant. So the week after that rain is high risk for nitrate poisoning, particularly in fast growing grassy things. So corn, cereals, some of our fast growing grasses, orchard grass, that kind of thing. There's a bit of a risk of nitrate poisoning there just because the plant has suddenly all of this nitrogen come in and it hasn't had time to turn it into protein yet. So it takes time for it to catch up. That time is about a week. Once you're past that week, probably your risk of nitrate poisoning is relatively low. If you're concerned about it, you can get it tested. The labs that do forage analysis usually offer a nitrate test. It's not part of the standard analysis. It's a separate thing, but most of them offer that. So yeah, nitrates would be the thing I would watch for with fertility. For our perennial pastures, no more than 50 pounds an acre of actual N at one time. I wouldn't go later than September, early September if you're in the north, late September if you're in the south. Yeah, the thing with applying light nitrogen is it kind of keeps grasses still going, and some of them don't harden off for winter as nicely as we would like if we apply nitrogen too late in the fall. So
okay. Yeah. Any recommendations on grazing corn stover stocks for the winter?
Yeah, it can be a good feed for dry cows. So probably going to be really tough for any kind of stockers, yearlings, weaned calves. Not a good option for them. Can be a good option for cows. One thing to watch is if for some reason that combine, like if they missed the buggy and there's a pile of grain out there, or for some reason they kicked a pile of grain out the back all at once, there can be a risk for rumen acidosis. So when grazing corn stalks on a grain field, scout it first, take a walk, see if you can find any of those potential problem zones. And the other approach would be to strip graze it. So subdivide that field and just give them a few days worth at a time. That way the odds of them gorging themselves on the grain, because they will go for the grain first, like that's the ice cream. They'll eat all the grain they can find and then go, oh, okay, and start eating the stalks. So if you can give them smaller areas at a time, that forces them to have a more balanced diet. So instead of going and eating all of the good stuff in the field and then eating all the fiber, they're getting some grain and some fiber a little more consistently throughout the season. And that would be some stover that it might be good, especially if you've never grazed corn stalks before. It'd be a good one to get a forage analysis done on, just to see, will you need to supplement any protein on that? Yeah.
Okay. I've got a final question here that could probably be for Dan or Christine. What is the price of hay across the province currently?
Expensive.
Evan or Thomas might know this too if either of them know and want to pop in, but
yeah, I know hay trading here because of this shortage. It's just, baled in the field, they'll come and pick it up 4x4s or $70. Like, so that was first cut, and not tested. Just the brokers are grabbing what they can at pretty good prices for the seller, I guess, but not for the buyer. But I don't know other areas for sure.
So Dan's final sentence, I think, is really important. Hay markets in Ontario are very local or regional in nature. So what's a reasonable price in one part of the province could be, a basement bargain or highway robbery, depending on where you actually live. So hay prices aren't something that OMAFRA tracks, because most of those buying and selling of hay is farmer to farmer. It doesn't go through a third party like an auction or a grain elevator. So I don't have any data on that. Your best resources would be your local classified ads. There will probably be some ads both to sell or looking for up on ontariohaylistings.ca. So that's a free resource that Ontario Forage Council puts out for you guys to use to buy and sell hay. It's classified ads. But yeah, your local producers that have been selling hay regularly into the local market, they usually know kind of what that market will hold, and so they'll price accordingly. But I don't have any data of what the going price is across the province.
Yeah, and just to go on with that, one of our producers in the chat area has put some contact information if anybody's looking to purchase any hay. And I know the Ontario Forage Council has also put up on their website opportunities to reach out and find people who are selling and buying hay. So if anybody is interested, those are some resources to go and find some information. With that, we reached the end of our questions that we've had. So yeah, and we've gone over a little bit of our time. So that was some great questions and great discussion. So thanks again, Christine, for joining us today and answering all of those questions and providing some insight for us. If anybody knows of anybody who wasn't able to make it today, we are posting this webinar online, so you can find that there. As well, we do have a resource page that we've posted on our website, ontariobeef.com, with some dry condition management resources that you can find there. So you can certainly find some information there if you're looking for it. So once again, thanks, Christine, for joining us today and providing us with that information. That's very helpful. And thanks, Dan and Evan and Thomas, for coming and providing us with some information as well. So that's fantastic. So thanks everybody for attending, and hopefully we can all gets a little bit more rain that we've been having lately to help us out for the rest of the summer. So thanks again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
All right.